Dad, please tell me this is not true.
There is a moment in every person's life when the ground shifts beneath their feet. Not a trembling, not a warning, just a sudden, irreversible collapse of everything they believed to be solid and real. For most people, that moment arrives and then eventually passes. The pain fades, the wound heals. Life, somehow, finds a way to continue. But for one family, a family that stretched across 2 countries, 2 generations, and 2 continents, the moment that came for them did not pass. It did not fade. It arrived in the form of a single piece of paper inside a hospital in Houston, Texas, and it rewrote the entire history of their lives in one breathless sentence. A doctor stood in a sterile corridor holding 2 DNA reports, one in each hand, and for a long time he simply could not move. Because what those 2 reports told him should not have been possible. What they revealed was not a medical anomaly. It was not a clerical error. It was the long shadow of a decision made by a desperate young man more than 2 decades earlier, a decision that took less than 1 hour to make and a lifetime to destroy. 2 people had fallen in love in that city. 2 young people who met by accident, who laughed at the same things, who dreamed the same dreams, who built a life together with the careful tenderness of people who had found something rare. They had stood before their families and made promises. They had built a home. They had become, to everyone who knew them, the kind of couple that made people believe love was still possible in a complicated world. And then a doctor sat them down in a quiet room, and he told them the truth. And the truth was this: they shared the same blood. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you are about to hear is one of the most devastating, most haunting, and most important stories we have ever told. This story does not begin in that hospital corridor. It does not begin with the couple, or with the doctor, or with the DNA report. This story begins thousands of miles away, in a city full of color and noise and warmth, with a young man standing on the side of a road watching a bus pull away. He had a duffel bag on his shoulder, a folded piece of paper in his pocket, and a feeling in his chest that he could not quite name. It was somewhere between terror and hope. It was the feeling that comes when you have made a decision that cannot be undone, when you have chosen to leave behind everything you have ever known, because staying feels like slow suffocation. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Marco. He was 22 years old. He had never been to the United States. He spoke English with the careful, deliberate pronunciation of someone who had learned it from textbooks rather than from people. And he was about to discover that the country he had been dreaming about his entire life was far more difficult, far more lonely, and far more expensive than any textbook had ever warned him. The questions that will haunt you throughout this story are simple ones. What does a man owe to the children he will never meet? What happens when a single private act of desperation reaches forward through time and wraps itself around the lives of people who were not even born yet when it was committed? And perhaps most painfully of all, what happens when 2 people who love each other discover that the love they built their entire lives upon was, from the very beginning, built on a foundation that the world would never allow? These are not hypothetical questions. They are not the plot of a film or the invention of a novelist. They are the questions that a real family was forced to answer, in real time, inside a real hospital, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. And by the time this story is over, you will find yourself asking a question of your own. You will find yourself sitting very still and asking, could this happen to someone I know? The answer, as you will come to understand, is far more likely than you think. Marco grew up in Guadalajara, Mexico, the youngest of 4 children in a household where money was always discussed in whispers and ambition was treated like a dangerous luxury. His father worked 6 days a week at a manufacturing plant and came home each evening smelling of machine oil and exhaustion. His mother sold tamales from a cart on the corner of their street every Saturday and Sunday morning, rising before dawn to prepare the masa, wrapping each one in its corn husk with the same patient precision she had learned from her own mother decades before. They were not a family that complained. They were a family that worked. And from the time Marco was old enough to understand what work meant, he understood that the path out of scarcity was not luck. It was education. He watched his older siblings settle into the same neighborhood, the same kinds of jobs, the same careful smallness of a life lived within tight boundaries. And he loved them deeply, but he did not want their lives. He wanted something that did not yet have a name in his vocabulary. By the time Marco was in his late teens, that nameless something had found a shape. It looked like a university campus in the United States. It looked like a degree in engineering. It looked like a version of himself standing in front of a whiteboard, solving problems that mattered, building things that lasted. His teachers told him he was gifted. His parents scraped together money they did not really have to pay for an English language course. His older brother drove him to the American consulate for his student visa interview and waited outside for 3 hours. When Marco walked out of that building with a visa stamp in his passport, his brother embraced him on the sidewalk so tightly that Marco later said it felt like being held by the entire neighborhood at once. That was in the spring of 2001. By that autumn, Marco had been accepted to a university in Houston, Texas. He had a one-way bus ticket. He had $200 in cash. He had a phone number for a distant cousin who had agreed to let him sleep on a couch for the first 2 weeks. And he had a dream so large and so certain that he could not imagine anything big enough to stop it. The first few months were not what the dream had promised. The university was real, and the classes were real, and the professors were brilliant. But the cost of everything, rent, food, textbooks, the bus fare to campus, was a kind of violence that Marco had not prepared himself for. The distant cousin's couch became unavailable after 2 weeks, as promised, and Marco found himself sharing a single room in a boarding house with 2 other students, one from India and one from South Korea, neither of whom he could fully communicate with in those early weeks. He ate instant noodles 4 nights out of 7. He calculated every purchase down to the cent. He called home on Sunday evenings and told his mother that everything was fine, that the university was wonderful, that Houston was beautiful. He did not tell her that he had started skipping lunch to save money. He did not tell her that the boarding house had no heat that first November, and he slept in his coat. He did not tell her any of the things that would have broken her heart, because he was 22 years old, and he still believed that the dream was survivable if he just held on tightly enough. By January of his first year, Marco had fallen behind on his rent. The boarding house owner, a heavyset man named Gerald who chewed toothpicks and watched television at maximum volume through the thin walls, had given Marco 2 weeks to come up with the overdue balance or find somewhere else to live. Marco had $43 in his checking account. He had already sold his watch. He had already written to his parents asking for help and received a reply that tore him open. His father had written back with apologies rather than money, explaining that the plant had cut hours and that things were tight at home too, that they were praying for him, that they were proud of him, that he should not give up. Marco sat on the edge of his cot in that cold room and read that letter 4 times. And then he folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of his jacket, the same pocket where he kept his student ID, and he went out into the Houston winter to figure out what to do next. It was on that walk, a walk with no real destination, just the need to move and to think, that Marco passed a community bulletin board outside a laundromat on Westheimer Road. Most of the flyers on that board were the ordinary debris of urban life: guitar lessons, apartment sublets, lost cats, pizza delivery. But one flyer was different. It was printed on pale yellow paper in a plain black font, and it said this: "Healthy male donors needed. Compensation provided. Confidential." There was a phone number at the bottom and a small logo for a medical clinic. Marco stood in front of that flyer for a long time. He had heard of sperm donation before, in the abstract, the way you hear of things that exist in the world without ever imagining they will become relevant to your own life. He thought about it for the rest of that day and through most of that night, and in the morning he called the number. The clinic on Westheimer Road was clean and professional and entirely unremarkable. The waiting room had beige walls and a water cooler and a rack of outdated magazines. A woman at the front desk gave Marco a clipboard with a series of forms to fill out: medical history, family background, education level, physical description. He answered everything truthfully. He was 22, healthy, no known hereditary conditions, college educated, 5 feet 10 inches tall, dark hair, dark eyes. He had never been told anything was wrong with him medically. When the clinic coordinator reviewed his forms, she smiled and told him he was an excellent candidate. She explained the process to him in the kind of brisk, practiced language of someone who had explained it hundreds of times. She told him that his donation would be screened, frozen, and made available to families who were struggling to conceive. She told him that his identity would remain anonymous. She told him that the compensation for a qualifying donation was $1,500. Marco nodded through all of it. Later, he would struggle to remember exactly what she said, because his mind had already done the calculation. $1,500 was 3 months of rent. $1,500 was survival. He completed his donation that same afternoon. The whole process, from the moment he walked through the door to the moment he walked out again, took less than 2 hours. He was handed an envelope at the reception desk. He did not open it until he was outside, standing on the sidewalk in the thin January sunlight. Inside was a check made out to his name for $1,500. He stood there holding it and felt something loosen in his chest, the particular relief of a person who has been holding their breath for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to breathe. He called no one. He told no one. He walked to the nearest check-cashing place, paid the fee, and pocketed the bills. He paid Gerald his overdue rent that same evening. He bought groceries. He ate a real meal for the first time in weeks, and then he put the whole experience in a compartment in the back of his mind, labeled it as a private and necessary transaction, and he moved on. He had no reason to think about it again. He had no reason to believe it would ever touch his life in any way that mattered. In that belief, he was catastrophically wrong. What Marco did not fully understand that day, what many young men who donated at American fertility clinics in that era did not fully understand, was the extraordinary reach that a single donation could have. The United States fertility industry in the early 2000s was, by the standards of most developed nations, almost entirely without meaningful regulation. According to research published by the U.S. Donor Conceived Council, there were no binding federal laws governing the number of children that could be born from a single donor's genetic material. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine had issued a non-binding guideline suggesting that clinics limit a single donor to no more than 25 families within a given geographic area. But this guideline was voluntary. It was unenforceable. And in the years that followed Marco's visit to that clinic on Westheimer Road, his donation was not used once. It was not used twice. Records that would only surface decades later, through the miracle and the curse of commercial DNA testing, would eventually show that Marco's genetic material had been used to create children in at least 11 separate families across the state of Texas. 11 children who grew up knowing nothing about each other. 11 children who carried the same biological inheritance without any awareness of what that shared inheritance might one day mean. Marco knew none of this. By the spring of that same year, he had found a part-time job at a copy shop near campus, enough to keep him from the edge of crisis without consuming all of his study time. His grades improved. His English became more fluid, more natural, less like a performance and more like a second skin. He made friends, real friends, the kind forged in the particular crucible of being young and poor and far from home together. He found his footing. The dream, which had come so close to dying in that cold room in Gerald's boarding house, began to feel real again. And by the time Marco graduated 4 years later with his engineering degree and a modest but genuine sense of accomplishment, the afternoon in the clinic on Westheimer Road had been so thoroughly buried beneath the texture of his daily life that it had ceased to feel like a memory at all. It felt, if it felt like anything, like something that had happened to a different person, a younger, more desperate version of himself who no longer existed. He packed his belongings, said goodbye to his friends, and boarded a flight back to Mexico. He was going home. He was going to build his life. He had no idea that part of his life had already been building itself, without his knowledge, in the homes of 11 strangers across the city he was leaving behind. Guadalajara received him the way home always receives those who have been away long enough to have earned their return. His mother made a meal that took 2 days to prepare. His father shook his hand and then embraced him, a gesture that in their household carried more weight than any number of words could have held. His sisters had married and had children of their own in the years he had been gone, and the nieces and nephews who crowded around him at the welcome-home dinner were a joyful, shrieking proof that life had not paused in his absence. Marco spent several months reconnecting with his city, learning which streets had changed and which had stayed the same, reacquainting himself with the particular rhythm of a place that had shaped him, even as he had shaped himself away from it. And then he found work, real work, the work he had crossed a border and survived on ramen noodles for, at an engineering firm in the city, and the life he had spent 4 years building in his imagination began, piece by piece, to take physical form. He met Elena at a birthday party for a mutual friend in the spring of 2006. She was a school teacher with a quick laugh and a way of listening that made you feel, when she looked at you, like the only person in the room. Their courtship was unhurried and certain in the way that some relationships are from the very beginning, not a question of whether, but only of when. They married in December of 2007 in a church that had stood in their neighborhood for over 100 years, with their families filling every pew. Marco stood at the altar in a suit his mother had pressed 3 times that morning and watched Elena walk toward him and felt, with a completeness that surprised him, that every difficult thing he had ever done had been leading to this exact moment. He was not a man given to philosophical reflection, but he felt that day that the long arc of his choices had bent, at last, toward something good and permanent. They honeymooned in Oaxaca and came home to a small house they had saved for together. In 2008, Elena became pregnant. In 2009, their son was born. They named him Carlos. Carlos arrived into the world with a lung full of noise, and his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, and from his very first week on earth he seemed to understand that he was loved. He grew up in that small house with the certainty that children develop when they are raised in warmth, a certainty that the world is fundamentally navigable, that the people around you are fundamentally trustworthy, that tomorrow will be essentially like today, and today is good. Marco coached his youth soccer team for 3 years. Elena read to him every night until he was old enough to read to himself, and then continued reading alongside him for years after that, the two of them working through novels together on Sunday afternoons. Carlos was bright and curious and kind in the particular way that children are kind when kindness has been modeled for them since birth. He was not a perfect child, no child is, but he was, by every measure that mattered, a good one. He was, above all things, deeply and unconditionally loved. And the years passed with the particular grace of years in which nothing catastrophic happens, which is the only kind of grace that most of us ever truly experience, but rarely recognize until it is gone. By the time Carlos was a teenager, Marco had been promoted twice at his firm and was managing a team of younger engineers. Elena had become the head of the primary school where she taught. They had repainted the house twice, expanded the garden, replaced the old car with a newer one. They had, in all the ways that the world measures these things, built exactly the kind of life that Marco had left home to find the tools for. Not the glamorous American dream he had once imagined, but something quieter and more sustaining. Something real. On Sunday evenings, Marco sometimes sat on the back porch after dinner and thought about his years in Houston with a fondness that surprised him. He thought about Gerald and the boarding house, about the friends from his engineering cohort, about the copy shop, about the small victories and the larger ones. He did not think about the clinic on Westheimer Road. He had not thought about it in years. It was buried so deeply beneath the accumulated sediment of his actual life that it might as well not have existed. But it had existed, and its consequences were now 18 years old and about to buy a plane ticket. Carlos turned 18 in the spring of 2027, and the conversation that followed was not really a conversation so much as a continuation, a picking up of a thread that had been woven into the fabric of their household since Carlos was old enough to ask his father what it had been like. And what Marco had always told him, in the measured way that fathers tell their children the stories of their own youth, was that America had been hard but worth it, that the education had changed him, that the challenge of being young and far from home, and forced to rely entirely on yourself, was the kind of thing that built something in a person that could not be built any other way. He had not, in those tellings, ever mentioned the clinic on Westheimer Road. That detail had never seemed relevant. It had never seemed like anything other than a private, closed chapter in a book that no one else would ever read. Carlos listened to his father's stories with the particular attention of a son who was deciding whether to follow. And in the end, he decided to follow. He applied to 3 universities in Texas. He was accepted at 2. He chose the one in Houston, in the city that had made his father. He packed a single large duffel bag, a detail his mother noted with a soft, complicated smile. And in August of 2027, he flew to Houston to begin. Carlos arrived in Houston with advantages his father had not had. He spoke excellent English. He had enough money saved, between his own earnings from part-time work through his high school years and the contribution his parents had insisted on making, to cover his first semester's housing without anxiety. He had a smartphone with a map and a university orientation app and a group chat with 3 other incoming students from Latin America whom he had connected with online before the semester began. The landscape of being a young international student had changed enormously in the 26 years since his father had made that same journey. And yet, some things had not changed at all. The loneliness was still real. The distance from home still had a physical weight to it. The need to make yourself from scratch in an unfamiliar place still required the same essential courage. Carlos felt all of it, but he was his father's son, and he was built for it. He settled into his studies quickly. He was an engineering student like his father before him, and he had inherited not only his father's aptitude but his father's discipline, the ability to sit with a difficult problem until it yielded. the refusal to surrender to confusion when patience and method would eventually produce clarity. His professors took notice of him early. His classmates liked him for the quality that his mother had seen in him since childhood, the genuine interest he took in other people, the way he listened as though what you were saying was the most important thing currently being said in the world. He made friends easily and real friends slowly, which is the proper order of things. He called home every Sunday evening, reversing the ritual his father had performed in the same city a generation earlier. He told his parents that everything was fine, that the university was wonderful, that Houston was beautiful. And unlike his father, he was telling the truth. For Carlos, at least in those first months, the dream was delivering on its promises. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He was building exactly what he had come to build. And then, in the second semester of his first year, he met Sophia. Sophia grew up in Houston. She had been born there, raised there, educated there, and she possessed the particular ease of a person who has never had to rebuild themselves in a new place, who has always been, wherever they stood, at home. She was 20 years old when she and Carlos met, a junior in the same engineering program, and she had the reputation in her cohort of being the person you went to when the problem set was breaking your brain. She tutored unofficially, out of generosity rather than obligation, at a table in the university library every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Carlos found her there on a Thursday in February when his calculus was refusing to cooperate, and she explained the concept he was struggling with so clearly, with such perfect economy of language, that he sat back when she was done and said, without thinking, that was the clearest explanation of anything he had ever heard. She laughed. He laughed. And something shifted between them in that moment with the silent efficiency of things that are meant to happen. Sophia had been raised by her mother, Diane, a quiet and fiercely capable woman who worked as a hospital administrator, and had raised her daughter alone since Sophia was 3 years old. Sophia knew that she had been donor-conceived. Her mother had told her when she was 7 years old, in the simple, honest way that child psychologists and parenting books had by then widely recommended, as though it were a fact of ordinary life rather than a secret to be managed. And to Sophia, it had always felt like exactly that, an ordinary fact. She knew that the donor was anonymous. She knew that she had no biological father in any meaningful sense of the word. She had occasionally, during adolescence, felt a mild and passing curiosity about where half of her genetics had come from. But she had never pursued it. She had a mother who loved her absolutely. She had friends who were family to her. She had a life that felt whole. The missing piece of her biological origin had never, to her, felt like a wound. It had simply felt like a fact, an unremarkable, closed, settled fact. It did not occur to her that it was waiting. Carlos and Sophia spent the rest of that semester studying together, which became eating together, which became long walks along Buffalo Bayou in the evenings, which became phone calls that ran so late into the night that they both arrived at morning lectures hollow-eyed and smiling. He told her about Guadalajara, about his parents, about the Sunday dinners that stretched into the late afternoon, about the particular smell of his mother's kitchen when she was cooking something slow. She told him about growing up in Houston, about the summers at her grandmother's house in Galveston, about the way her mother had raised her to be independent without ever making her feel unsupported. They were honest with each other in the way that people are honest when they sense that dishonesty would cost them something they do not want to lose. By the end of that first year, they were inseparable in the way that precedes all the decisions that follow. They were in love in the complete, encompassing way that older people look back on and say, that was real. That was the real thing. And it was. Every part of it was real. Which is precisely what made what happened next so incomprehensible. They graduated together in 2031. Carlos proposed the week after commencement on the bridge over Buffalo Bayou, where they had taken their first real walk together 2.5 years before. Sophia said yes before he finished the sentence. They were married the following spring in a ceremony that brought Marco and Elena from Guadalajara for the first time since Marco had left the city 3 decades earlier. Marco walked through the Houston streets on the afternoon before the wedding, with the specific emotion of a man visiting the site of his own young self, recognizing corners and buildings with a sensation somewhere between nostalgia and wonder. He stood outside a hardware store on Westheimer Road and looked around at the changed and unchanged geography of the neighborhood and felt the years between his former self and his current one as a physical distance. He did not notice that the laundromat with the bulletin board was gone now, replaced by a smoothie franchise. He did not think about what had once been posted on that board. Why would he? The wedding was the following morning, and his son was going to marry the woman he loved, and the world was as good as Marco had ever felt it to be. They built a life together in Houston with the focused joy of people who are certain they have found the right person and the right city and the right moment. Carlos accepted a position with an engineering firm downtown. Sophia joined a structural consultancy in the medical center. They rented an apartment in Midtown with tall windows that let in the late afternoon light, and they furnished it slowly, deliberately, choosing each piece together, building a home the way people build homes when they are doing it for the first time and want to do it right. They talked about children with the same unhurried certainty with which they talked about everything. Not now, but soon. First, the jobs. First, the savings. First, the feeling that they had given themselves enough time to be just the two of them before they invited anyone else into what they were building. They were happy in the specific, textured way that is possible only when the happiness is not performance, but simply the natural condition of two people who have chosen well. The first sign that something was wrong with Sophia appeared in the winter of 2033, almost 2 years into their marriage. It was subtle enough at first to be dismissed. Unusual fatigue, a persistent heaviness in her joints that she attributed to a long stretch of intensive project work at the consultancy, a pallor that her mother noticed during a Sunday dinner and mentioned gently, the way mothers mention things they are afraid to name directly. Sophia made an appointment with her GP, who ran blood work and looked concerned at the results and referred her to a specialist. The specialist ran more tests. The tests produced results that required consultation with another specialist. The clinical language was precise and frightening in the way that clinical language always is when it is describing something the doctors do not yet fully understand. What they knew was that certain markers in Sophia's blood indicated an autoimmune condition, a disorder in which the body's own immune system was, for reasons not yet clear, mounting an attack on healthy tissue. The condition was rare. It was not, the specialists assured them, immediately life-threatening. But it required investigation. It required monitoring. It required, above all, more information about Sophia's genetic history. And this was the question that the geneticist asked, in the careful language of someone who already suspected the answer would be complicated. Was there any family history of autoimmune conditions on her biological father's side? Sophia explained quietly that she was donor-conceived and that the donor was anonymous. The geneticist nodded and noted it, and said that in that case it would be helpful to pursue donor identity through commercial DNA testing, that the genetic information might be medically significant. Sophia agreed. She had never done a DNA test before. The casual curiosity of her adolescence had never quite pushed her over the threshold into actually doing it. But this was different. This was medical. This was necessary. She ordered the kit from a commercial company that evening. 6 weeks later, the results arrived in her email inbox while she was eating breakfast. She almost did not open it immediately. She was running late for work, and the notification sat in her inbox through the morning and through her first 2 meetings, and it was only at lunch, sitting alone at her desk with a sandwich she was not really eating, that she finally clicked through to the results. The genetic ancestry breakdown was interesting but not surprising. A mix of European and North American origins that confirmed the vague sense she had always had of her own demographic history. She was about to close the browser when she noticed a different section of the results page. It was headed Close DNA Matches, and the first name on the list, with a probability percentage so high that the interface had flagged it with a colored indicator, was a name she recognized. The name was Carlos Rivera. The probability of a close biological relationship, 49.8%. The estimated relationship according to the algorithm, half-sibling. Sophia sat very still for a very long time. She read the number again. She read it a third time. She thought for a single wild moment that there must be an error, a mix-up in the samples, a database glitch, the kind of technical failure that occasionally made these services unreliable. She thought of Carlos at home that morning, the particular way he had kissed her goodbye at the door, the coffee mug he had left on the counter that she had washed without thinking about it. She thought of their apartment with its tall windows. She thought of the wedding on the bridge. And then she closed her laptop and sat in her office for the remainder of the lunch hour without moving, because she did not yet know what to do with what she had just learned. And the body, when it receives information of this magnitude, sometimes chooses stillness as its first response, before the mind catches up and grief begins. Sophia did not tell Carlos that evening. She called her mother first. Diane listened in silence as Sophia explained what the DNA test had shown, and then there was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough that Sophia said, "Mom?" And Diane said, "I'm here, I'm thinking." And Sophia said, "What does this mean?" And Diane said what any parent says when a child asks a question for which there is no good answer. She said, "I don't know, baby. I don't know yet." But they would need to find out. They called the genetics department at the hospital where Diane worked, and by the following morning they had an emergency appointment with a genetic counselor who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, which was itself a terrifying indicator of how not unusual this situation actually was. The counselor was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Patterson, who had the particular quality of manner developed by people who regularly have to deliver news that dismantles lives, a steadiness that was not coldness, a composure that was not indifference. She reviewed the DNA results and requested that both Sophia and Carlos undergo a more comprehensive clinical DNA analysis. They would need a full genetic panel, not just the commercial test. They would need formal lab results before anyone could draw any clinical conclusions. Sophia nodded. Carlos, who had now been told, sat beside her and held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The results of the clinical DNA analysis came back 9 days later. 9 days in which Carlos and Sophia went to work and came home and ate dinner and watched television and lay in bed at night and did not talk about the thing they were waiting to talk about, because they were both terrified that talking about it would make it more real than it already was. They were adults with engineering degrees and analytical minds and the capacity to assess data without flinching, and they were both, in those 9 days, entirely unable to apply any of those skills to the problem that was sitting in the middle of their lives. They waited. They held hands. They were, in spite of everything, very kind to each other. And then, Dr. Hugh Patterson called Sophia's phone on a Wednesday morning and said she would like them both to come in. Dr. Patterson's office was a room with plants on the windowsill and a box of tissues on the corner of the desk, a detail that Carlos noticed and filed away as they sat down, because the presence of a tissue box in a specific location in a doctor's office means something. Dr. Patterson spread 2 printed reports across the desk, and looked at them both with the steadiness she had spent decades developing. She said, "The results confirm what the commercial test indicated. There is a biological relationship between you that is consistent with a half-sibling connection. You share a biological father. The donor whose genetic material was used to conceive Sophia was a man whose DNA profile is a match for Carlos Rivera, Carlos's father. Marco Rivera." The room was entirely quiet. The plants on the windowsill did not move. The box of tissues remained on the corner of the desk, and Carlos and Sophia sat across from Dr. Patterson and felt the entire architecture of their lives rearrange itself around a single sentence that could not be unsaid. Carlos called his father that night. It was 10 in the evening in Houston and midnight in Guadalajara, and Marco answered on the second ring with the alert, slightly concerned tone of a parent who receives phone calls at midnight and immediately assumes the worst. Carlos said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Marco said, "Of course. Anything." Carlos said, "When you were in Houston in 2001, did you ever donate to a sperm bank?" There was a silence. It was not the silence of a man who does not understand the question. It was the silence of a man who understands it completely, who recognizes with a terrible clarity exactly why the question is being asked, and who feels in the space of that silence the full weight of a decision he made in a cold winter 30 years ago collapse forward through time and land, finally, on the life of the person he loves most in the world. Marco said yes. He said it very quietly, and then he said nothing else for a long time because there was nothing else to say. And Carlos held the phone and looked across the room at Sophia, who was sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap. And he said to his father, in the voice of someone delivering news that no son should ever have to deliver to his father, "She is your daughter." Marco wept. He wept in the way that men of his generation and background rarely permit themselves to weep, without restraint, without composure, without any attempt to manage or contain the sound of it. Elena, woken by his crying, came into the room where he sat and held him without knowing yet what had happened, simply held him the way you hold someone when you understand that they have been broken by something you cannot see, and that the only thing you can offer is your presence. He told her. He told her all of it, the boarding house, the cold January, Gerald and the rent money, the pale yellow flyer, the clinic on Westheimer Road. He told her the thing he had never told anyone in 30 years of marriage, the private transaction he had buried so completely beneath the accumulating layers of his real life that he had almost managed to convince himself it had no weight. Elena listened without interruption, and when he was done, she sat in silence for a moment. And then she asked the only question that mattered. What happens now? What happened next unfolded over the following months with the grinding, meticulous cruelty of a process that is irreversible. Carlos and Sophia met with a family attorney who specialized in donor conception cases. The legal situation was, in the broad strokes, clear. The marriage, having been entered into without knowledge of a biological relationship that would make it legally impermissible in the state of Texas, was voidable. The dissolution process was painful not because of conflict. There was no conflict between Carlos and Sophia, no anger, no blame, no desire to wound each other, but because of the particular grief of dismantling something that had been, in every way that the two people involved could measure, genuinely good. Their marriage had not been a mistake in any emotional or experiential sense. It had been, by every measure that mattered to them personally, one of the best things that had ever happened to either of them. But the law and biology, operating together with their indifferent precision, do not make exceptions for the quality of a love. Diane, Sophia's mother, underwent her own private reckoning in those months. She went back to the records she had kept from the fertility clinic, a folder she had not opened in more than 2 decades, and looked at the donor profile she had selected in the spring of 2001. The information was scant, as it always was from anonymous donors of that era. Ethnicity, education level, height, eye color. A brief written statement from the donor describing himself in general terms. There was no name, there was no photograph, there was a donor number. And somewhere in the clinic's records, that donor number corresponded to a 22-year-old engineering student from Guadalajara who had walked in from the cold with a $43 bank balance and a desperate need to keep a roof over his head. Diane sat at her kitchen table and looked at the donor profile for a long time. And she felt something that she had no clean word for, not anger at Marco, who had been as ignorant of the consequences as anyone, but a grief at the system, at the industry, at the extraordinary cavalier absence of oversight that had allowed something this catastrophic to unfold, as though it were simply the natural consequence of market forces and individual choice. Because here is the thing that must be understood about Marco's situation, the thing that gives this story its full and terrifying dimension. Marco was not a predator. Marco was not a man who had acted without conscience or with any intent to harm. He was a 22-year-old student in a foreign country who had been offered money for a medical procedure by a licensed clinic and had accepted, as any desperate young person might accept, and had been told by that clinic that his donation would be used responsibly, that his anonymity would be protected, that the limits on how many families could use his genetic material would be enforced. And in the United States in 2001, none of those assurances had any legal weight. According to researchers at the U.S. Donor-Conceived Council, the United States was, in that era and for decades afterward, operating as what one legal scholar described as the Wild West of the global fertility industry. There were no binding federal limits on how many children could be born from a single donor's genetic material. There were no mandatory registries. There was no system of tracking. There was only a voluntary guideline that recommended no more than 25 families per donor, a guideline that, as the same researchers noted, was frequently exceeded in practice precisely because there was no mechanism to enforce it. Marco had not failed his son. A system had failed them both. Carlos relocated from Houston in the summer of 2034 after the legal process was complete. He went back to Guadalajara for a period and then to Mexico City, where he found work with a construction engineering firm and began, with the particular dogged patience that his parents had both modeled and passed on to him, the process of rebuilding a life. He and Sophia remained in contact, a fact that strikes many people when they hear this story as either remarkable or entirely inevitable, depending on how they understand love. The relationship they had built was real, and real things do not evaporate simply because the context around them changes. They had been, before they were anything else, each other's closest friend. That did not change. What changed was the shape of what they were to each other. The world required a different word for it. They found one, eventually. They called it family, which, in the most fundamental biological sense, had always been exactly what they were. Marco's story is not unique. It is not even unusual. In the 2 decades since the events of this story unfolded, the American fertility industry has been forced, gradually and reluctantly and largely, through the pressure of advocacy groups made up of donor-conceived people themselves, to confront the scale of the problem it had allowed to develop. The cases that have come to light are numerous enough to constitute not a series of individual tragedies, but a systemic failure of the most profound kind. A CNN investigation published in 2024 confirmed what advocates had been saying for years, that across the United States, more than 30 fertility doctors had been identified as having secretly used their own genetic material to inseminate patients, and that advocates believed the actual number was at least 80. One Indiana doctor fathered more than 60 biological children through this method, each of them growing up without knowing the truth of their origin. A Netflix documentary examined one such case in detail and brought the phenomenon to mainstream awareness. But the problem extended far beyond fraudulent doctors. It extended to the entire structure of an industry that had been allowed, for decades, to operate without meaningful oversight. The researcher and advocate Dylan Stone Miller, who had donated as a college student and later discovered that his donations had resulted in 96 births, became one of many voices calling for legal reform. His story echoed Marco's in every essential detail. A young man, financially pressed, offered compensation for a procedure whose long-term consequences he had not been equipped to fully understand. The difference between Marco's story and Stone Miller's, or between Marco's story and the stories of dozens of documented cases, was not one of character or intent. It was one of scale and of the particular genetic lottery that determines which donor-conceived children will end up in proximity to their half-siblings, which of those half-siblings will find each other through DNA testing, and which of those encounters will arrive not as a welcome discovery, but as a collision. A professor of law at Indiana University, quoted in a CBS News investigation into the industry, put it plainly, "We regulate gasoline more comprehensively than we regulate the creation of human lives." She was not speaking rhetorically, she was describing an actual fact. The commercial DNA testing industry, which arrived in earnest in the mid-2000s and expanded rapidly through the following decade, changed everything. It did not change the rules of the fertility industry. It did not retroactively impose the oversight that had been absent for decades. What it did was remove the anonymity that the entire architecture of the industry had been built upon. In one account documented by the U.S. Donor Conceived Council, a woman discovered through a DNA test that her high school boyfriend, a relationship that had been serious enough that marriage had been discussed, was her half-sibling, one of 22 children conceived through the same anonymous donor. In another account reported by CNN, a donor-conceived woman discovered that she had attended elementary school with a half-sibling, had lived across the street from another, and had gone to high school with 3 more. The sibling groups, when the DNA tests began to surface them, were not the small, manageable clusters that clinic guidelines had promised. They were enormous. They were scattered across cities, across states, across years, and the people within them had been living their lives in proximity to each other without any awareness of what they shared. For Sophia, the DNA test had been a medical necessity, but for thousands of other donor-conceived people in the years following this story, it was simply curiosity, the ordinary human desire to know where you came from, to understand the biological architecture of your own existence. And what many of them found, when the results came back, was not the simple clarification they had been hoping for, but a disruption of something they had believed to be settled. The half-sibling matches appeared on their screens like messages from a reality they had not known existed. Some of those matches were welcome. Some of them were not. And some of them, a small number, a devastating number, arrived in the inboxes of people who had already built entire lives in proximity to those half-siblings, who had already made promises to them, who had already braided their futures together. These are not hypothetical harms. These are documented cases. They are the predictable, preventable, and entirely unnecessary consequences of an industry that placed profit above precaution and anonymity above accountability. Marco made a decision in one desperate hour on a January afternoon in Houston, Texas. He was 22 years old. He was broke and afraid, and doing what young people do when the options in front of them are all bad. He chose the least bad option. He could not have known what it would cost. He could not have known that the clinic's assurances of responsible use would prove, in practice, to be meaningless. He could not have known that the son he would raise with such love and intention would one day make the same journey he had made to the same city, and fall in love with a woman whose existence was the direct consequence of his most private and forgotten moment. He could not have known any of it. And yet it happened. Not because Marco was a bad man, not because he failed to think carefully, but because a system existed that allowed it to happen, that was, by design or by negligence, indifferent to the human consequences of the thing it was selling. There is a word in Spanish, destino, that translates to destiny, but carries within it a weight that the English word does not quite hold. It suggests not only that certain things are fated to occur, but that the fates themselves are threaded through time in ways that are invisible to the people living within them. Marco's destino was not the donor clinic. His destino was Carlos and Elena, and the life they built together. But the thread that ran between his one desperate hour and his son's greatest grief was always there, invisible, patient, waiting for the moment when technology would finally catch up with biology and make the invisible visible. That moment came, it will keep coming. The at-home DNA tests are now ubiquitous. They are given as holiday gifts. They are marketed as personal wellness tools. They are used by millions of people every year who have no idea that the results might reach backward into their family history and surface something that was never meant to be surfaced, something that was meant to stay buried in a sealed file in a clinic on Westheimer Road. What Carlos and Sophia experienced is not a cautionary tale about love, because their love was not the problem. It is not a cautionary tale about Marco, because Marco was not the villain. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when an entire industry is allowed to treat the most intimate biological facts of human life as a commercial transaction without consequences, when the need for regulation is acknowledged and then ignored, when the guidelines that exist are non-binding and the enforcement mechanisms that should exist do not, when the people most affected by the absence of those protections are the ones who have the least power to demand them. It is a story about the distance between a decision and its consequences, and about the fact that distance is never as great as we imagine it to be. Every choice we make moves through time. Most of them dissipate harmlessly, but some of them travel. Some of them travel through blood, through genetics, through the quiet, invisible channels that connect us to people we will never meet and to futures we cannot see. Some of them arrive, decades later, in the form of a DNA result on a laptop screen during a lunch break. Marco is in his mid-50s now. He does not talk about this story easily. He has spoken about it once, to a journalist writing about donor conception regulation in Latin America, and in that conversation he said something that stayed in that journalist's mind long after the article was published. He said, "I was not thinking about the future when I walked into that clinic. I was thinking about tonight. I was thinking about tomorrow. I was thinking about whether I would be able to stay in school. And I think that is the truest thing I can say about why this happened. Not that I was wrong exactly, but that I was not thinking far enough. And the system was designed to make sure that I didn't have to, that the thinking was someone else's problem, and it turned out that no one was doing the thinking. So the consequences landed on my son, and that is something I will carry for the rest of my life. Before we close, we want to ask you something, and we want you to sit with it rather than answer it immediately. The question is not whether you would have made the same choice as Marco. That is too easy a question. The real question is this: in your own life, in the private decisions you have made and are making and will make, how far forward are you thinking? Not to tomorrow, not to next year, but to the version of yourself that will exist in 20, 30 years, and to the people who will be living inside the consequences of the choices you make today, people who do not yet exist, people whose names you do not yet know. People who will love and be loved and build lives in the long shadow of this present moment. That is the question this story asks. That is the question that Marco and Carlos and Sophia and Diane all had to answer, each in their own way, each in their own grief. And it is the question that the fertility industry in the United States is only now, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to answer too. The laws are changing, the regulations are coming. But for one family in one city, they came too late. And the price of that moment, that one cold January afternoon in 2001, was paid not by the man who made the decision, but by the son who inherited its consequences, and the woman who loved him. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something you were not expecting to feel, we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done in Marco's place? There is no right answer. There is only the truth of what you would have done in the cold and the desperation of an ordinary winter afternoon, with $43 in your account and a landlord waiting. Tell us. We want to know. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it now, not for us, but so that the next time we bring you a story like this one, you will be there to hear it. Because the stories we tell here are not entertainment. They are evidence. Evidence of what we are capable of and what we owe to each other, and how far the ripples of a single human moment can reach before they finally come to rest.